No one in the auction room understood why Nolan Reed would pay $222 for a blackened, engineless helicopter that had been officially declared scrap metal. C.E. Blackwood laughed out loud, signed the sale papers right in front of him, and gave him exactly 10 days to haul the wreckage off her airfield. But when Nolan crouched beneath the charred fuselage and scraped the soot from the belly panel, a nearly erased serial number emerged from the ash. 10 days later, a convoy of black vehicles belonging to billionaire Conrad Sterling stopped outside Nolan's hangar, with a team of lawyers and a $20 million check. Subscribe to the channel and drop your best guess about what Nolan saw that no one else in that auction room could. The liquidation sale at Blackwood Airfield drew the kind of crowd that only gathers when a once proud empire starts shedding its skin. Brokers in pressed suits, fleet managers from competing carriers, and a handful of scavengers who specialized in buying industrial machinery at 10 cents on the dollar, then flipping it quietly before the ink dried on the paperwork. Blackwood Aviation Holdings had not publicly announced its debt crisis, but the size of the auction lot told the story plainly enough. 47 aircraft, 9 ground vehicles, a wall of avionics equipment still in their factory crates, and 3 rows of stripped rotorcraft frames that would never fly again. Vivian Blackwood stood near the registration desk in a charcoal blazer, her expression calibrated to project authority rather than urgency. Though anyone who watched her eyes move across the lot could see she was calculating every figure in real time, running the numbers against the quarterly deficit she had spent the last 4 months trying to minimize before it reached the board. She was 38 years old, the third generation of Blackwoods to hold the company's top position, and she had learned to treat every material object in her world as either an asset or a liability. A discipline that had served her well in most situations and was about to fail her completely in one. Nolan Reed arrived 20 minutes before the opening gavel, not because he had anything significant to bid on, but because he needed a backup generator for his repair shop, and word had it. There were 2 of them buried somewhere in the mechanical inventory near Hangar 7. He wore a canvas work jacket that had been washed so many times the original olive color had faded to something closer to gray, and the clipboard he carried held a single handwritten list of 3 items with price limits written in pencil beside each one. The kind of man Ham planned carefully because he had no room for mistakes. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that came from actual labor rather than a gym, and he moved through the auction lot the way a person moves through a library, slowly, deliberately, reading things other people walked past. At the far end of Hangar 12, behind a row of decommissioned turbine housings, he found something that stopped him completely. The helicopter was covered with a gray tarp that had not been changed since the last time the hangar flooded, and when a gust from the open bay doors lifted one corner, Nolan saw a section of fuselage so thoroughly blackened by fire damage that the original paint color was no longer identifiable. The auction listing clipped to the tarp frame described it in 4 clinical lines. Model unknown, no engine present, no airworthiness certificate, sold as scrap only, buyer responsible for removal within 10 days. Everett Slade, Blackwood's chief financial officer, was already moving the crowd toward the next item when Nolan lifted the tarp and crouched low to examine the undercarriage, his hands moving across the frame with a slowness that was not hesitation but attention. He did not look at the damage. He looked at what the damage had failed to reach, and what he saw in those 30 seconds was enough to make his hands stop moving. The airframe was titanium, not the standard aluminum alloy used in commercial rotorcraft of that era, and the rotor hub above him carried 6 vibration-dampening mounts arranged in a pattern he had seen only once before, in a set of engineering drawings that an old man had shown him in a cluttered workshop more than 15 years ago. Nolan straightened up, looked at the serial plate beneath the cowling, and made an offer of $222, every dollar of cash he had left after purchasing the generator. Vivian Blackwood, who happened to be walking the row at that moment with 2 board members behind her, heard the bid and paused long enough to ask whether he planned to turn the machine into a garden feature or a storage shed, and the laughter from her companions carried the specific register of people who are amused by something they assume costs them nothing. When he told her he would move it under his own power and at his own expense, she signed the transfer documents without looking at them a second time, handing the clipboard back to her assistant with the careless motion of someone discarding a grocery receipt. But before Nolan pulled the tarp back down, he angled a flashlight at the belly of the fuselage near the nose section, and what the beam caught in the soot, almost erased, almost gone, made him exhale so slowly it barely moved the air around him. The characters were stamped into the metal beneath 3 layers of char, HX1001. He had seen that designation once, written in the margin of a dead man's notebook beside a warning that had stayed with him for years. If this prototype still exists, do not let Blackwood find it first. Nolan spent $400 he did not technically have on a specialized flatbed transport with a low-profile ramp, charged to a credit line he used for shop equipment, and paid down slowly over 3 months whenever a job came in large enough to cover more than rent. It was the kind of financial decision that made his stomach tighten when he thought about it directly, so he chose not to think about it directly and focused instead on the sequence of tasks required to move a rotorcraft with no engine, no documentation, and a rotor assembly that had been sitting unmaintained in a flood-prone hangar for an indeterminate number of years. Cassidy called while he was inventorying the work. She was 17 and had access to the family banking application, and the alert she received when the transport charge processed was enough to make her phone him immediately. He told her the truth, which was that he had purchased something that could either rescue the shop from its 2-year slide toward insolvency, or confirm that his instincts had finally crossed the line from expert judgment into wishful thinking, and he promised to explain the rest when he knew the rest himself. At the airfield, 2 of Blackwood's line crew stopped to watch him remove the rotor blades by hand, not offering to help, making observations to each other that were clearly intended to be heard. Nolan paid attention to the work and not the commentary, because every bolt he turned was giving him information about the machine's construction history, and that information was more valuable to him than anything the audience could offer. Vivienne passed through the hangar a second time and reminded him without pausing that the storage fee after day 10 would exceed the value of the aircraft on a daily compounding basis, which was her way of communicating that she expected him to abandon the project before the deadline arrived. Before she left, Nolan asked her, quietly, without aggression, whether anyone at Blackwood had ever mentioned a program called Halcyon, and the question landed in the air between them with a weight she did not seem to understand, because the name produced no recognition in her expression at all. Everett Slade, who had been standing 6 feet away examining a separate clipboard, turned his head with a speed that was disproportionate to a question about something that allegedly did not exist, and he told Nolan with a precision that was a full degree too sharp that Blackwood had no program by that name, and the question was not relevant to the transaction. Back at the shop, Nolan worked through the first 3 evenings in methodical silence, photographing every rivet, every weld seam, every stress mark on the airframe. In the sequence, a structural examiner would follow, then comparing the images to technical manuals he had stored on an external drive, and to a series of sketches he kept in a fireproof box under the workbench. He cleaned the serial surfaces with a chemical solution used for restoring aviation identification plates, isolated the sections of the airframe, that showed evidence of original factory finishing rather than field modification, and sealed 3 internal components in protective foam because he was not certain yet whether handling them without documentation would reduce their evidentiary value later. What the examination confirmed first was that the fire had not started inside the helicopter. The soot pattern ran from the upper rotor mast downward, consistent with flame falling from above, which meant the aircraft had been parked in a burning structure rather than igniting from within its own systems. Beneath the cabin floor access panel, bolted directly into the main structural frame, with hardware that had been installed during original assembly rather than added afterward, he found a fireproof container approximately the size of a large book, sealed with a tool-specific torque pattern that would be obvious to anyone who knew what they were looking for. Inside the container there was no currency, no jewelry, and no conventional document. There was a roll of undeveloped photographic film sealed in a protective canister, a small embroidered patch bearing the Sterling family crest, and a machined metal identification tag stamped with 6 words. Evelyn Sterling, Test Pilot No. 1. The Halcyon HX-1 program produced almost nothing searchable through conventional research channels. A few oblique references in aviation industry newsletters from the early 1980s, a single paragraph in an independently published history of experimental rotorcraft that referred to the program in the past tense and placed its conclusion in 1983, and a corporate press release from Blackwood Aviation dated that same year announcing the discontinuation of an unnamed advanced rotorcraft initiative due to budget constraints. Every source agreed on one thing without variation. The sole prototype had been destroyed in a hangar fire that occurred during the final phase of testing. Nolan spent 2 days reading everything available before concluding that the absence of detail was itself a form of information, because programs that end in ordinary failure tend to generate ordinary documentation, while programs that end in deliberate suppression tend to generate silence. He reached Miriam Chase through a retired avionics instructor who had worked at Briar Glen's vocational program in the 90s, and remembered her as someone who had once quietly transferred a large collection of technical drawings out of Blackwood's archive before they were scheduled for destruction. Miriam was 58 and lived 40 minutes outside the city in a house where 3 rooms were dedicated to filing systems organized by decade and subject. And when Nolan called her, she listened to the first 40 seconds of his explanation before asking him to stop. She told him she had signed a non-disclosure agreement with Blackwood Aviation that covered any information about internal projects predating the current corporate structure, and that she took contractual obligations seriously, regardless of whether the party who issued them still had the moral authority to enforce them. Nolan thanked her for her time and sent a single photograph. The rotor hub, centered in frame, with the 6 dampening mounts clearly visible. Miriam called back 11 minutes later. She told him that the Halcyon program had been funded privately by Gideon Blackwood, Vivian's father, as a parallel development track outside the company's main product line, and that the engineer at its center was a man named August Calloway who had designed a rotor dampening system capable of reducing high-speed vibration to levels that no commercial helicopter of that era had achieved. The program ran for 4 years and produced 1 complete prototype, which flew successfully on 3 separate test occasions before Gideon's primary investor withdrew his capital and the internal board voted to discontinue. The official record stated the prototype was destroyed in the hangar fire of 1983, and Miriam stated, with the careful specificity of someone who had rehearsed that sentence, that she had personally processed the paperwork relocating a rotorcraft airframe to Hangar 12 6 months after the reported destruction date, under an order signed by Gideon Blackwood and marked with the notation, "Do not disassemble, do not list, Do not transfer without direct authorization. Nolan sent her a photograph of the identification tag, and Miriam confirmed that Evelyn Sterling had been the primary test pilot for the Halcyon program, and that her name had been removed from every official report during the project's closure. Not for technical reasons, but to prevent Conrad Sterling's father from asserting any intellectual property claim over the flight data his wife had generated. Miriam told Nolan she was glad the machine had survived, and then she told him something less welcome. If the provenance of the HX-1 became known before he had legal control of the documentation, there were people who would move very quickly to challenge his ownership, and he needed to be prepared for that. The email from Blackwood Aviation's legal department arrived the following morning, 47 minutes after Nolan had ended the call with Miriam, and it stated that the sale of the helicopter might need to be rescinded because a significant piece of intellectual property had been inadvertently included in the scrap lot, and that Nolan had 48 hours to arrange its return. Vivienne arrived at the shop with Everett and 2 lawyers in a car that cost more than Nolan's annual revenue, and the 4 of them entered without knocking, which told Nolan everything he needed to understand about how the next hour was going to begin. She was not laughing this time, and the tone she used was the one typically deployed when a corporation believes it has made an embarrassing error that needs to be corrected quietly before anyone with a court filing notices, measured, formal, stripped of the casual contempt she had shown at the auction. She explained the situation the way she probably explained most things, as a procedural matter, a misclassification, an administrative gap that had allowed the helicopter to be included in a lot it was never intended to join, and she made clear that the company was prepared to compensate Nolan generously for the inconvenience. The offer was $222 plus $25,000 in a wire transfer, conditional on Nolan signing a non-disclosure agreement before the end of the business day. Nolan listened to the complete offer without interruption, then set the original bill of sale on the workbench between them, positioned so all 4 visitors could read it without leaning. The document stated explicitly that the buyer acquired full title to the airframe, all attached components, all interior contents including stored materials, and all rights to restore, transfer, or negotiate the asset independently, with the sale price accepted as fair consideration by both parties at the time of signing. Everett argued that the fireproof container and its contents constitute proprietary company materials that had been inadvertently enclosed in a scrap transaction, which was a claim that required its own counter-argument, namely that the container was bolted to the structural frame during original assembly and had been included in the sale by the precise terms of a document that Everett himself had reviewed before Vivienne signed it. Vivienne increased the offer to $100,000 without consulting anyone in the room, which was the kind of move that told Nolan she had a number in her head that was significantly higher and was calibrating upward based on his silence. Nolan declined again, and this time he explained his reason. She had not asked him what the helicopter was, had not asked what he had found, had not expressed a single question about the engineering or the history or the people whose names appeared inside it. She had only asked how much money it would take to make the problem disappear, which was the wrong question from someone who claimed to be in the business of aviation. The conversation shifted temperature several degrees when Everett, standing slightly behind Vivienne's right shoulder, told Nolan in a tone designed to sound administrative that he had become aware of discrepancies in the repair shop's licensing documentation that might warrant a regulatory review, a threat so thinly veiled that even the lawyers in the room looked briefly uncomfortable. Vivienne did not stop Everett, and she did not support him, and that particular combination told Nolan more than either action would have alone. She was not the architect of the pressure being applied, but she was willing to see how far it would go before she intervened, which made her complicit in a way that stopped short of malice and landed somewhere in the more common territory of willful convenience. After they left, Nolan spent 40 minutes photographing the interior of the rotor hub with a macro lens before he found what he was looking for. A mark so small, it would have been invisible to anyone who was not specifically searching the mounting surface of the first dampening assembly. Stamped into the metal in characters no taller than a few millimeters were 9 words that changed the evidentiary weight of everything he had collected. A. Calloway, Serial 1. Directly below the stamp, in the same machined typeface, was a set of geographic coordinates. The coordinates led to a building at the edge of the Blackwood Aviation Complex that had been reclassified as a general storage facility sometime in the mid-90s, and which currently held 17 years of accumulated corporate documentation, scheduled for destruction on a rolling basis as the digital archiving project advanced through its various phases. Miriam Chase still held a contractor access card from her last engagement with the company's records department, and she used it with the permission of the overnight archive manager, who understood she was collecting materials for a historical review project. They moved through the building the way both of them moved through most things, methodically, with every action documented, leaving nothing disturbed that had not been specifically examined. What they found in the back section of the archive, in a set of boxes flagged with a red destruction tag dated 2 weeks out, was a collection of materials that should not have survived the 1983 program closure. The original engineering drawings for the HX-1 rotor assembly, annotated in Calloway's handwriting with corrections and notes that dated across a 4-year span. A set of black and white photographs showing Evelyn Sterling standing beside the helicopter at various stages of the test program. Performance reports documenting 3 successful flight tests with speed and stability metrics that significantly exceeded the design specifications, and a letter written by Gideon Blackwood addressed to no specific recipient, explaining his decision to preserve the prototype rather than destroy it, and requesting that whoever eventually found these materials understand that his intent had always been to correct the historical record when the financial and legal pressures that had forced the program's closure had sufficiently receded. There was also a shorter document, an unsent letter addressed to Conrad Sterling, in which Gideon acknowledged that Evelyn's contribution to the program had been deliberately minimized in the official record to prevent litigation, and that this was the decision he regretted most among all the decisions he had made in 40 years of running the company. Miriam held the photograph of Evelyn Sterling for a long time before she set it down on the document table, and then she told Nolan that Conrad had spent close to $3 million over the preceding decade hiring aviation historians, archive researchers, and private investigators to locate any verifiable trace of the HX-1 because every official source confirmed its destruction, and he had never been fully convinced by a record that seemed to have been written by people with a reason to close the question. Nolan had not yet contacted Conrad Sterling and had no intention of doing so before the documentation was complete, because arriving at a billionaire's office with a story and a helicopter, but without independent verification, was a way of creating a negotiation where the other party controlled the information advantage, and information advantage was the one thing Nolan could not afford to lose. While Nolan and Miriam worked through the archive, Everett Slade was executing a different sequence of tasks, none of them involving physical force, but all of them designed to create enough administrative friction to dislodge Nolan's legal position before it became immovable. A licensing audit initiated through the State Aviation Board, an inquiry directed to the building management company holding Nolan's hangar lease, all conducted through official channels in ways that were technically permissible but clearly calibrated to apply pressure rather than correct any actual compliance gap. What Everett did not know was that Vivian had begun separately reviewing the asset management records from the 2 years preceding the auction, prompted by something Nolan had said about Hangar 12, and what she found when she pulled the inventory logs was that the helicopter had been removed from the company's registered asset list under Everett's authorization. Not through any standard deaccession process, but through a single reclassification entry that moved it from active inventory to a category labeled unresolved scrap with no corresponding board approval. She found a second anomaly when she cross-referenced Everett's communications from the same period. An email sent to a metal recycling company owned by his brother-in-law, specifying a pickup date for materials from Hangar 12 contingent on the auction lot, producing no competing bids. Vivian opened the private document safe her father had kept in the executive suite, a safe she had known about for years and never opened because he had asked her not to until she needed to, and inside she found a single sealed envelope addressed in his handwriting with 4 words on the front, "For the one who finds Halcyon." Inside that envelope was a photograph, and in the photograph, a young Nolan Reed stood beside August Calloway in a workshop that Vivian recognized immediately as the annex attached to Hangar 12. Nolan Reed had not stumbled onto the HX-1 by accident, and the full arc of how he came to be standing in that auction hangar on that particular morning was not a story about luck or coincidence. It was a story about what happens when a specific kind of knowledge is passed carefully from one generation to the next by someone who believes the knowledge matters even when the world has stopped rewarding it. August Calloway had been 61 years old when Nolan was 23 and working a summer apprenticeship at a small experimental aircraft facility outside Denver. And the company had hired Calloway as a technical consultant, despite the fact that his reputation in the industry was primarily a record of projects that had been canceled, programs that had been defunded, and ideas that had been labeled too unconventional for practical application. Nolan had been assigned to assist Calloway on a systems review of a prototype fuel management unit, and what was supposed to be a 3-week engagement extended to nearly 2 years because Calloway had no interest in working alone, and Nolan had no interest in doing the easier thing when the harder thing was more instructive. Calloway never told Nolan the HX-1 existed by name, but he taught him everything about the problems it was designed to solve. The fundamental physics of high-speed rotor vibration, the specific metallurgical properties that made titanium superior to aluminum for structural frames under sustained torsional stress, and the engineering principle that a machine's value was not located in its ability to perform under optimal conditions, but in the sophistication of the problems its designer had anticipated and solved in advance. Before Calloway died, he gave Nolan a cloth-bound engineering notebook containing partial drawings and calculation sets for what he described only as a program he had worked on that had ended before its time, and he told Nolan that if he ever encountered a machine that matched those specifications, he should look past whatever condition the machine was in and ask what its original designers had been trying to solve. That instruction had lived in Nolan's memory for 15 years the way a calibration lives in a measuring tool, present and ready without needing to be thought about, until the moment it was needed. Vivian came to the shop alone late on the afternoon of the 6th day, without attorneys, without Everett, without the protective formality she had maintained through every previous visit. She told Nolan she had found the photograph and asked him directly whether he had known his connection to the HX-1 before the auction, and he answered her honestly. He had recognized the machine from Calloway's descriptions and drawings, but he had not known it was in that hangar, had not known it had been preserved rather than destroyed, and had no prior contact with anyone at Blackwood that would have given him advance access to the auction inventory. He told her that Gideon Blackwood had apparently made a promise to Calloway, specifically, that the prototype would be preserved and not dismantled, and that the company had come very close to breaking that promise without realizing it. Vivian did not argue with his account, and she sat on a metal stool near the workbench and was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable before she said she wanted to understand what the machine actually was, before she made any further decisions about what Blackwood should or should not do. Nolan opened the access panel on the main transmission housing and walked her through what the interior showed. The fire that had damaged the fuselage exterior had not penetrated the primary structural cavity, and the rotor assembly inside was in a condition that a specialist would describe as extraordinary, given the passage of time. The titanium components showed oxidation consistent with long-term storage rather than active degradation, and the experimental dampening system was mechanically intact in all 6 mount positions. Vivian watched the examination without speaking, and Nolan could see the moment when the scale of what Blackwood had nearly sold for $222 became fully real to her, not flash of emotion but a slow, changing understanding, the kind that settles rather than strikes. Miriam called while they were still at the workbench and told Nolan that Conrad Sterling had learned the HX-1 had resurfaced and that he was making arrangements to travel to Briar Glen. Before the call ended, she added that Everett Slade had filed a motion through a third-party law firm requesting a judicial hold on the helicopter, arguing that it contained proprietary technology belonging to Blackwood Aviation, with the hearing scheduled for the following morning. Nolan's legal resources consisted of a general practice attorney in the city who had handled his shop's incorporation and occasional contract reviews, and the documentation he had accumulated over the previous 6 days, which was extensive but had not yet been formally authenticated by any third party with institutional standing. Everett's motion was filed through a firm that specialized in intellectual property claims and asset recovery, and the asymmetry between the two positions would have been discouraging to anyone who processed it purely as a financial matchup. Nolan did not process it that way. He spread the auction documents across the workbench and identified the 4 points at which the sale's legitimacy was most clearly established: the public nature of the auction, the written inventory listing that described the helicopter as scrap with no reserved rights, the signature on the transfer agreement, and the explicit terms of the bill of sale covering interior contents. The motion Everett had filed rested on a single argument: that Nolan had knowingly purchased a misclassified asset at a price that constituted acquisition by deception, requiring the court to accept that Nolan had possessed knowledge that Blackwood's own staff did not have at the time of the auction, and that this asymmetric knowledge had been used to deprive Blackwood of fair market value. Nolan's response, drafted with his attorney over a single 4-hour session, argued the inverse. Blackwood had set the terms, written the listing, established the auction rules, and accepted his bid after an open process during which any bidder could have examined the same machine. If the company had failed to recognize the value of what it was selling, that failure was Blackwood's own, and it could not be remedied by retroactively attributing to the buyer a deceptive intent that the company's own documentation did not support. The more dangerous development was happening inside Blackwood simultaneously, where Everett was presenting the board with a version of events in which Nolan was characterized as a sophisticated operator who had exploited an administrative weakness to acquire a multi-million-dollar asset for a trivially small sum. A framing designed to make the board feel victimized rather than responsible, and to position Everett as the person who had identified the problem and was working to correct it. Vivian had been listening to this account with a growing sense of contradiction, because nothing she had observed during her visits to the shop matched the portrait Everett was constructing, and the inventory audit she had already initiated was producing results that pointed in a completely different direction. She pulled the full communications archive from the period surrounding the auction and found the email to the recycling company, which documented that Everett had known the helicopter contained valuable materials and had arranged for their extraction through a related party, which was not the behavior of an executive who had accidentally misclassified an asset, but the behavior of one who had deliberately isolated it. Vivian convened an emergency board session and did three things in sequence. She acknowledged that she had signed the sale agreement personally and the signature was genuine and had been given willingly after reviewing the listing. She confirmed that the company's legal position in any challenge to the sale was weak because the bill of sale was comprehensive and the auction process had been procedurally sound. And she disclosed Everett's communications with the recycling company and the unauthorized reclassification of the asset, characterizing it as an attempt to divert company property to a related party, which was the kind of statement that needed to be made in front of witnesses and on the record. Everett was placed on administrative suspension before the board session ended, and the law firm handling the judicial hold was notified that Blackwood Aviation would not be proceeding with the motion. Nolan received confirmation that the filing had been withdrawn before the court had scheduled it for review, which resolved his immediate legal exposure, but did not answer the more fundamental question he still needed to address. He could prove the helicopter existed, prove it had been sold to him legitimately, prove it contained materials of engineering significance, but to establish what it was actually worth, he needed someone who could confirm the identity of this specific machine from a source that predated any document he had found. The roll of photographic film had been sent to a specialist lab for restoration 3 days earlier, and the results arrived the evening Everett's motion was withdrawn. The first frame showed a woman in a flight suit climbing into a cockpit. The last frame showed a young man standing beside her, his hand resting on the fuselage, his face turned toward the camera with the expression of someone who has just watched something extraordinary and is trying to memorize the feeling. On the morning of the 10th day following the auction, the precise deadline Vivian had specified for removal, a convoy of 4 black vehicles arrived at Nolan's repair facility in a sequence that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. A lead car, a transport vehicle, a second passenger car, and a trailing vehicle that parked across the lot entrance in a way that closed the space without blocking it. Conrad Sterling was 64 years old and moved like someone who had never stopped measuring the structural integrity of things he was about to touch, and when he stepped out and looked at the hangar, he did not immediately look at Nolan. He looked at the building's framing, the width of the bay doors, the angle of the morning light on the interior, and something about that scan told Nolan that the man had spent a long time imagining what this moment might look like before it arrived. Conrad's team included his personal attorney, a certified aircraft appraiser with specific credentials in historical rotorcraft, a former test engineer from a program that had run in parallel to Halcyon during the same era, a curatorial specialist from the Sterling Aerospace Foundation, and a man who carried nothing but a briefcase and was introduced without further explanation. Conrad himself carried a photograph, not one of the recovered film images which he had not yet seen, but a personal photograph that he produced from his jacket and held next to the nose section of the helicopter for 30 seconds before folding it carefully and returning it to his pocket. He told Nolan that his mother had made a specific mark on the airframe during the first full flight test, a pressure scratch on the left side of the nose cowling that she used to mark any aircraft she flew for the first time, and that he had been looking at it for the past 30 seconds. Conrad then told Nolan about Evelyn Sterling in the way people tell stories they have been carrying for a very long time, carefully, with pauses in the right places, leaving space for the weight of specific details. Evelyn had not been hired as the Halcyon program's test pilot from the beginning. She had been brought in during the third development phase when the original pilot flagged a handling instability at high forward speed that the engineering team could not reproduce in ground simulation. And she identified the problem in 2 flights: a resonance frequency in the rotor system that only manifested above a specific combination of airspeed and altitude, and her documentation of the issue allowed Callaway to modify the dampening assembly in a way that eliminated it entirely. The program's final 3 flights, the successful ones, used the corrected system, and Evelyn flew all 3. When the program closed, her name was removed from the flight reports at the instruction of legal counsel, who argued that her documented involvement would create a contractual basis for the Sterling family to claim rights over the program's intellectual outputs, and Conrad had spent nearly 2 decades looking for any evidence that the HX-1 had not been destroyed, because the destruction records had been filed 3 months after Evelyn's death, and he had never believed the timing was coincidental. The appraisal team worked through the afternoon, examining the serial plate, the rotor assembly's unique weld signature, the dampening mount configuration, the performance log recovered from Miriam's archive, the restored photographic film, and a set of handwritten notations on the cockpit panel interior that the curatorial specialist identified as Evelyn Sterling's and cross-referenced against a sample from her personal correspondence in the Foundation's collection. At late afternoon, the appraiser confirmed in writing that the aircraft was consistent in every verifiable detail with the Halcyon HX-1 prototype, serial number 1, and that no evidence existed of a second airframe having been built under the program. Conrad opened the briefcase and set a bank check on the workbench beside the original bill of sale, and the amount written on it was $20 million. Vivian Blackwood and 3 members of her board stood along the far wall of the hangar as witnesses, and the room held its breath in the way rooms do when everyone present understands simultaneously that the number on a piece of paper is only the surface of something much larger. Nolan looked at the check for a long moment without touching it. Then he told Conrad there was one condition that still needed to be settled. The silence after Nolan spoke was not the silence of confusion. The people in that room were too experienced to be confused by a man declining to immediately accept $20 million. But it was the silence of recalibration, the mental adjustment that occurs when a situation does not follow the rules. Everyone assumed it was following. Vivian looked at Nolan with an expression that for the first time contained no calculation at all, only attention, and Conrad remained completely still in the way that people who have learned to read character remain still when something interesting is happening. Nolan set 3 conditions on the workbench beside the check, stated in the same calm, direct voice he used when he was explaining a mechanical problem to a customer who needed to understand it clearly. First, the helicopter was to be displayed in a public institution, not held in a private collection. Second, the installation text would include the names of Evelyn Sterling and August Callaway, and every engineer and technician who had contributed to the Halcyon program, whose name could be verified from the historical record. Third, Nolan would personally oversee the restoration process, not to make the aircraft airworthy, but to preserve it in the condition most accurate to its original state and its specific history, including its history of having been nearly lost. Conrad accepted all 3 conditions without negotiating any of them, and the evenness of his agreement made clear that he had expected something in this territory and was relieved to find it was possible. He explained that $20 million was not simply a market price for a historical artifact, but was structured as the acquisition cost for legal title, the complete provenance documentation, and a permanent agreement that the HX-1 would never be separated from its records or sold as components. And it included a commitment that the Sterling Aerospace Foundation would fund the display installation and ongoing preservation without any further cost to Nolan or claim over his involvement in the restoration work. Vivian, standing at the edge of the group, watched Nolan receive terms from a billionaire and make 3 requests, none of which involved additional money, and the specific quality of her silence in that moment suggested that the event was functioning as a recalibration for her in a way she had not anticipated when she drove to the hangar that morning. The investigation into Everett Slade's conduct had uncovered patterns that extended beyond the HX-1 transaction. 2 other asset disposals from the previous fiscal year showed similar irregularities, and one of them involved a sale to a company with documented ties to the same brother-in-law. And Nolan had no interest in narrating the outcome of that process beyond what accuracy required. Vivian had addressed the company's staff directly, acknowledged that the auction had exposed a structural failure in how Blackwood assessed the historical value of its assets, and named Nolan Reed by name in the acknowledgement, which was the kind of gesture that meant more because it had not been required. Nolan accepted the apology with neither warmth nor resentment, which was harder to sustain than either emotion would have been. He told Vivian that arrogance was more expensive than technical failure in most industries, but especially in aviation, because arrogance caused people to stop asking questions about things they assumed they already understood, and the thing that nearly ended up in a recycling yard had been the most sophisticated rotor design produced in North America in its decade. Conrad reached into his jacket pocket and produced August Calloway's professional identification badge, obtained from the Sterling Foundation's archive, where it had been catalogued alongside materials donated by Calloway's estate, and he placed it in Nolan's hand and said that as far as he was concerned, Nolan had finished the work the old engineer had started. Before the convoy departed, Vivienne handed Nolan the sealed envelope from her father's safe, the one addressed to whoever found the Halcyon. Inside was a set of preliminary drawings dated 1984, labeled HX2, and a single handwritten line at the bottom of the first page. Halcyon was never meant to be only one. The drawings for the HX2 did not represent a hidden treasure in the literal sense. There was no second prototype waiting in another forgotten hangar, no buried cache of components that would produce a sequel to the HX-1 story on the same dramatic timeline. What they represented was something more useful and less cinematic, a record of intent, a document of what Gideon Blackwood had believed the Callaway rotor system could become if it were developed by people who understood it, rather than controlled by people who feared its implications for their existing product lines. The preliminary specifications described a rotorcraft optimized for rescue operations in mountainous terrain, low vibration signature for reduced crew fatigue on extended missions, structural frame tolerant of high-altitude pressure variation, rotor geometry designed to maintain stability in the wind shear conditions common to canyon environments. And it was a design that addressed a problem the commercial helicopter market had not solved in the 40 years since Callaway first sketched its solution. Vivienne's formal offer to Nolan was the position of Senior Technical Director at Blackwood Aviation, with a salary that reflected what the company understood his expertise to be worth in retrospect, and the offer was declined with the same straightforwardness he had applied to everything else. What he accepted instead was a structured independent contractor agreement that preserved every aspect of his operational autonomy while connecting his shop's work to Blackwood's resources in a specific and bounded way. Nolan's facility would manage the physical restoration of the HX-1 under his direct supervision. Blackwood would endow a technical scholarship program in the names of August Calloway and Evelyn Sterling through the Sterling Aerospace Foundation. The complete Halcyon program archive would be made available to academic researchers through a joint deaccession to a university library, and Nolan retained full authority over all decisions affecting his shop's other work, clients, and direction. The arrangement gave him what the $20 million alone could not have given him: institutional recognition of the value of the kind of knowledge he carried, and a formal connection between that knowledge and the next generation of people learning to carry it. The changes at Blackwood Aviation after the Halcyon disclosure were operational rather than theatrical. Vivienne restructured the asset management process to require a certified technical assessment by an independent engineer before any item with potential historical significance could be included in a liquidation sale, a policy that would have prevented every element of this situation from developing in the first place. And she did not make a public event of the change, which Nolan found more credible than if she had. The HX-1 was transported to the Sterling Aerospace Foundation's Restoration Center in a climate-controlled carrier, and the first thing Nolan did when it arrived was ask the facility to leave the scorched section of the upper fuselage exactly as it was. Not restored, not cleaned beyond what was necessary to stop active deterioration, but preserved in the state in which it had been found. He told the curatorial team that the burn marks were part of the machine's history and removing them would be the same kind of error as removing a name from a record, a tidying gesture that produced a less accurate and less honest result. Conrad Sterling stood in the restoration bay on the first day of the project and watched Nolan work the same way he had watched his mother work, with the particular attention of someone who understands that what is happening in front of them is something that cannot be fully recovered once it has passed. The HX-2 drawings were mounted under archival glass on the wall of Nolan's shop when he returned, pinned beside Calloway's notebook, and the rotor component he had been designing before the auction was still on the bench where he had left it. Slightly different now, informed by everything he had learned in the preceding 10 days, but recognizably descended from the same line of thinking that had produced the machine he had pulled from the ash. 1 year after the auction at Blackwood Airfield, the Halcyon HX-1 was unveiled at the Sterling Aerospace Foundation's museum in its permanent installation, displayed in a way that no standard aviation exhibit used. One half of the fuselage retained the fire damage exactly as Nolan had found it, the surface dark and uneven and honest, and the other half had been restored to the original silver finish that Evelyn Sterling had seen when she first climbed into the cockpit in 1981. The two states occupied the same machine simultaneously, and the effect was not dissonance but completion, the full arc of a thing that had been made and nearly lost, and then found by someone who was looking for the right reasons. The identification panel beside the helicopter listed 41 names, including every engineer, technician, and flight crew member whose contribution to the Halcyon program could be confirmed through the recovered archive materials, and Evelyn Sterling's name appeared at the top of the list, designated as primary test pilot, with a complete record of her flight test results printed in the accompanying catalog. Cassidy was there for the opening, and she stood in front of the installation for a long time before she turned to look at her father, who was standing near the edge of the room, watching the people who were watching the machine. She had understood for a year why he had spent their last $222 on a burned helicopter, but seeing it here, in this room, with these names on the wall, she understood something different and larger, which was not about the helicopter at all, but about the specific quality of attention that makes it possible to see value in a thing that everyone around you has decided is worthless. Vivian came to the opening without her board, without her assistant, without the organizational architecture that usually traveled with her. And she stood before the exhibit for a moment and said quietly, to no one in particular, that $222 was the worst financial transaction in Blackwood Aviation's history, and the most valuable lesson the company had ever been given for free. Conrad asked Nolan to speak to the press gathered outside. Nolan declined, shook Conrad's hand, and drove back to the shop, where the HX2 drawings were still on the wall and the rotor component on the bench was waiting to find out what it was going to become. He had not spent the $20 million on comfort or visibility, or the kind of distance that money usually buys between a person and the work they were made to do. He had spent it on space, more workbenches and better equipment, and 2 additional apprentice positions. A place where ideas that had been set aside could be looked at again by people with the patience to understand what they were actually looking at. The original bill of sale was framed on the wall beside the door of the shop, and beneath the printed text that read, "Unidentified helicopter, sale price, $222. Nolan had written 2 lines in black marker. A seller sets the price of a thing. The person who understands it decides its worth.
Oh wow. Not Ghost of Tsushima. Nah. What are some of the most popular Souls games? Elden Ring, Dark Souls. What are some of the most popular Souls games? I don't know why I can't think of it right now. What's a super hard Souls game? Like besides Elden Ring and Dark Souls games. Bloodborne. Sekiro, thank you. Sekiro, bro. Fuck that shit. That game is so hard. AI Limit? What's up, What Mangos? How you doing? What is that? How you doing, Bam Bam, as well? Get him! Damn. Search it up. Is that new? It's a Souls game? I hope you're playing Wukong. Try to beat as much as I can tonight. Got work too. Really?
Rat! You call that a duel? The glare up here is dazzling. Fight me in the woods if you have the guts.
Nice.